especially if it's the first experience. It is very sorry. And we can thank the rogue psychiatrist, actually psychologist Timothy Leary, for coming up with this idea of setting and substance. And before Tim Leary came along, in fact, they weren't actually called psychedelics, these things, they were called psychotomimetics, right? Because a bunch of psychiatrists got hold of them initially and figured they could be a good way of modelling psychosis. And they figured that because they gave a bunch of people LSD without any preparation, they locked them in a room, handcuffed to a bed, and sure enough these people had psychotic reactions. And there you go, induces psychosis. Let's call them psychotomimetics. And then Tim Leary came along. Here's Tim. This is actually after his professorial career at Harvard, when he turned into kind of psychedelic high priest, self-appointed, and became America's most wanted man, public enemy #1 because he'd been busted for cannabis and thrown in prison, and then with the help of the Black Panthers that busted out, gone on a run, found his way all the way to Afghanistan, and got caught by the feds, dragged back to the States and thrown in prison again. But before all of that, he did some good scientific research at Harvard, and he came up with this idea of setting a substance, because he said, well, what happens if you give people some LSD, but you put them in a room with some really nice, fluffy, like therapists with some kind of groovy music and some funky lighting, and people tend to have a really good time. Okay, so like the factors of set and setting are equally, if not more important, than the substance in determining the kind of experience you have. But if you don't pay attention to the factors of set and setting, you might have what we used to call a bad trip. We don't call them that anymore. We've come up with a new, more scientific sounding term. It's called difficult psychological experience. Ever see that Woodstock movie? Documentary. Yes, exactly. Yeah, not the new documentary about the later Woodstock. The original 60s, Woodstock is like in between all the amazing bands. So he comes on stage and goes, "We've had some reports of people having bad trips on the brown acid. So if you've had any brown acid, just stick your hand up, someone will come around and say, people, you always go, oh my God." Which if they weren't having a bad time, up until that point, they probably were about it. So bad, difficult psychological experiences do occur. We don't necessarily know how common they are. The majority of people seem to avoid them, but actually a lot of people do still have them. This beautiful pie chart from an internet survey shows that the majority of people in blue never have a bad trip. Those in green are like less than 10% of their experiences of bad trips, and those in red should certainly never take psychedelics because they only ever have bad trips. But it probably can be alleviated by paying attention, more attention to certain sectors, though not necessarily always. But it used to be said that psychedelics can send you mad. I think people can occasionally have psychotic reactions, usually quite temporary. It could actually trigger long-term psychotic states in some people. But it used to be said back in the 60s, if you've taken LSD 3 times, to check, 3 times, by definition, clinically insane, right? And we don't think that's true anymore because we've got some research to back it up, and there was these kind of large-scale epidemiological surveys done about 10 years ago, like huge samples, 130,000 people in 2 separate surveys, randomly selected from the National Register. They looked at their entire psychiatric history and their entire drug use history. Generally speaking, yes, recreational drug use means that you're more likely to have kind of more psychiatric poor indices, poor psychiatric health, mental health indices. Except for the case of people taking psychedelics, especially psilocybin. Those people are taking LSD or psilocybin had lower incidence of psychological distress, and those who are taking psilocybin had low 1-year use of psychiatric medications or inpatient treatment. There's a graph, just a lot of graphs just to show that. Basically below the top line is lower than the general population in terms of these psychiatric risk indices, and anything above the dotted line is greater than the general population, but it has to be, the bar has to be all the way across. So, generally speaking, the there is no direct relationship between the use of psychedelics and poor mental health, and something actually slightly in the opposite direction. This doesn't mean taking psychedelics will make you mentally more healthy. There could be other factors involved in this, but if taking psychedelics reliably sent people mad, then we would definitely see it kind of epidemiologically speaking across large populations. So I think that's most of the kind of the bad stuff. I should probably talk about some of the possible positive uses of psychedelics. That's all the risky stuff. Oh, actually, no, I've got some more risks I'm going to consider. So if you were developing psychedelics as medicines, which is currently going on, you might do a risk-harm, benefit-harm kind of analysis. And so you consider different factors. I've already talked about risks of psychosis and suicide are actually low, certainly no higher than the general population you've been seeing, according to most studies. The physiological risks of taking psychedelics in a clinical context, that is, are also very low. Like, so the most classic psychedelics, like psilocybin and LSD, have very few physiological side effects. Most of the side effects are psychological, if at all, and they also have very low toxicity, so that there's no practical overdose value that we know of for psilocybin or LSD. And we know that, for instance, because unscrupulous drug smugglers doing what unscrupulous drug smugglers do, you've got to cross the border, you've got a stash of drugs, you don't want to really hide it in your bag because they might find it, so you're just like, oh, I'm just going to wrap this up and swallow it, Which, in the case of LSD, or pure LSD, might not be the best idea in the world, particularly if you're not very good at wrapping things up. I want to case somebody who took 7 grams of LSD, didn't take it, tried to smuggle it. 1 gram of LSD you can fit in the palm of your hand, right? But that's 10,000 doses in a gram. And this guy kind of wrapped them up badly, swallowed them, got on the plane, plane takes off, carries on. The plane comes into land, he just keeps flying. Something happened. Yeah, 70,000 doses of LSD later, it didn't kill him. Right? That's quite astonishing, in fact. What who knows how long he was tripping for? This is hilarious when I get off plane. Dependency risks are also quite low as well. That is kind of like they're typically thought to be non-addictive, which runs counter to the kind of messaging that was sent out initially when they were originally prohibited as substances in the late 60s and early 70s. And in fact, a lot of psychedelics have been used traditionally, when their first kind of psychiatric use was in treating addictions, a bit like fighting fire with fire. And there was a recent study done where they used psilocybin to treat tobacco addiction, which is, tobacco addiction is very vicious, very difficult to treat. And they gave people 1 high dose of psilocybin and a little bit of therapy just to hold the experience. And then they followed them up 12 months later, and 2/3 of those that had high dose had remained free from tobacco. Right? So they quit for at least a year, 2/3 of them, which is one of the most successful tobacco cessation treatment programs ever by a country mile. Which is quite interesting when you think about it, right? Because psilocybin kills 0 people every year from overdose. No one, as far as we know, has ever died from psilocybin overdose. However, it has to be a Class A drug, so you can get up to 7 years in prison, maximum sentence, just for possession, and potentially a lifetime in prison for supply. And can be used to treat addiction to tobacco very, very successfully, which seems a bit odd, especially when you think like tobacco, it's legally available to anyone over the age of 18, is it now? 16? It kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, apparently, and doesn't get you off your psilocybin addiction either, right? And why would it? Because it turns out psilocybin is non-addictive. So there you go. Something a bit wonky there. Some of the other general risks are what we call hallucinative persisting perception disorder. This is a massive mouthful. HPPD, which used to be kind of considered to be like flashback. So the drugs wear off, you should be back to normal, but they don't necessarily always do that. You may still be having perception distortions, and in some cases they can last for the rest of your life. We don't necessarily know how prevalent this is. certainly less than 1% of the population who tried psychedelics, but we're still talking hundreds, thousands of people who can have long-term perceptual distortions from taking psychedelics, even just once. The way we're now thinking about this, and some recent research myself and some colleagues have been doing, is that it turns out that HPPD looks like a very, well, it's not a very new condition, but a condition that's only recently been identified, called visual snow syndrome, which some people have from birth. And it turns out the symptoms of HPPD look exactly like visual snow syndrome, and it could be that taking psychedelics for some people, they may be prone, they may be just kind of borderline visual snow, take psychedelic and it triggers visual snow experience. So we've got a better way of conceptualizing it. Potentially we could later screen people for genetic predisposition to visual snow, if that happens to be the case. So, but it is a genuine risk. And in some cases people develop synesthesia permanently, things like that, which turns out can be quite a freaky experience if you didn't have it before, and you suddenly can see sounds and taste shapes. That's it right that time. So that's all the risks over. That's it. It's just risky, basically. I think I should probably talk about some potential benefits. Do you want to hear about them? Mm-hmm. You probably know it because there's been a lot of news recently about the research that's been going on. And none of this is not really new, even though it's in the news, because all this research was done in the 1960s initially. And they were using psychedelics to treat addictions, as I've already said, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and end-of-life existential fear for people who have kind of terminal illnesses. All that research was done 60 years ago. It's found to be kind of very promising in these treatments, and we're just doing the same science again, but with better science now to convince regulators that these things have massive potential as medicines, which they seem to do. So a lot of that research is kind of in the early clinical trials phase, that's being developed as potential medicines. Some of these studies where you kind of pull together all the kind of existing clinical trials that are being done, as in the case they did here for treatment of end-of-life depression, and they found that in all of those studies, pretty much psilocybin was much better than placebo. So it's effective, it seems, at least relative to placebo. They're now starting to test these psychedelics psilocybin against existing SSRIs, and they seem to be coming out quite favourably as well. Nevertheless, all these results, in all these treatment modalities, seem to be extremely promising, so much so that the scientists have been kind of pushing for reclassification, so they can access to these substances for research and hopefully to develop them as medicines becomes a lot easier. And the FDA in the States, the Food and Drug Administration, which regulate new drugs, replied just about 3 years ago now and assigned breakthrough therapy status to both psilocybin and MDMA. Psilocybin for treatment of depression, MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, for treatment post-traumatic stress disorder. So that means that instead of it taking 20 years to go through the clinical trials and hurdles to get these things developed as drugs to the market, these could be licensed within 3 years. That was 3 years ago. They haven't been licensed yet, but they are kind of probably likely to get licensed quite soon. Who knows? That news was brought to us by a man with an unfortunate name. True story. Meanwhile, alongside all the kind of the legislation around medicalisation, there's been lots of moves you're probably aware of in the previous presidential election. There was also kind of votes on kind of legal status of various psychedelics and cannabis as well, and Oregon voted to legalise psilocybin, and that's just come into force this month. So the whole state of Oregon now can access psilocybin. We find that a lot of the states, and even states within the states and different cities and provinces and God knows where else, are also voting in their own way to either legalise or decriminalise. So we're seeing this massive shift around the legality of these things alongside the movement towards medicalisation. Anyway, I'm going to drill down into all those studies. So this is a study which is looking at treatment of end-of-life existential fear, and the depression and anxiety that goes along with it. These were all people with stage 4 cancer, i.e. terminal cancer, and they gave them either a low dose as a control, or a high dose of psilocybin and a small amount of psychotherapy inside. And the top two graphs, don't be overwhelmed by all the slides here. Top two are depression, bottom two are anxiety. The first chart is reductions in depression symptoms. And so they found that something like 30% of the low dose group had reductions in depression, which is interesting. About 90% of the high dose group had reductions in their symptoms of depression at 5 weeks. And then 6-month follow-up, the third part, is something like 80% of them still had reductions in their symptoms of depression 6 months later. The next chart along on top to the right is total cessation of depression, so that they were no longer considered to be significantly depressed. And we find something like 80% at 5 weeks, and that actually increased about 60%, to about 70% at 6 months. So after 6 months of one high dose of psilocybin was enough to kind of cancel the depression of 70% of the participants in this study. People have had end-of-life existential fear, depression, anxiety, and also that you see the same trend with anxiety, which is closely related to depression. And when they looked at the kind of factors important in that, it was showing that, yes, the intensity of the experience is important, but how spiritually meaningful the experience was. Because a lot of people are having what we might call a mystical experience. And like the more mystical their experience was, whether we define that, meant that they were more likely to have reductions in their depression and anxiety. Because as scientists, we love to measure anything and everything, including abstract concepts like how mystical is your experience? It was very mystical. Brilliant. We're going to get much better. And we find that pretty much in every study that's been conducted, every clinical trial with psychedelics that has used a measure of mystical experience, they found that the more mystical you experience, the greater are your clinical outcomes, in that greater reductions in depression, or tobacco craving, or alcohol craving, or whatever it might be. So pretty much all these studies, and in some cases it was very, very strongly related to the intensity of the mystical experience, which causes a bit of a conundrum for the current modern Western medical endeavour. Is that how do we what do we do with these substances, right? I mean, on the one hand, like psychopharmacology is, or pharmacology, what we do with drugs is like usually you give somebody a drug and they go away, they either get better or they don't, or whatever. Or you give somebody some therapy, some kind of psychotherapy. It's a psychiatric condition. But with psychedelics, it's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. It's neither either, but it's actually both. And that is because, the therapy alone isn't usually enough to have the impact that you have with the drugs, but you can't give people, a high dose of psilocybin without a bit of therapy. It's a bit like locking people in a room handcuffed to a bed on their first acid trip, right? They're more likely to have a terrible experience. So you have to have the two things together: psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. However, there has been a move towards completely taking the psychedelics experience out of psychedelics, and there are now drugs in development where they've taken classic psychedelic chemicals and they tweak them to create what they think are drugs which won't have a psychedelic experience, but will have whatever miraculous desired effects on the brain they're supposed to have to reduce people's psychiatric symptoms. These haven't yet been tested in humans, but in animal studies, supposedly, they look quite promising. And if they do turn out to be successful, that would kind of the whole kind of psychedelic research endeavour, the bottom will drop out of. So, nevertheless, we find that the mystical experience is important in predicting these kind of experiences, which to me suggests that the psychological experience of having a trip is somehow important in people's kind of better mental health. But what do we actually mean by mystical experience? If you've had one, you might know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't had a mystical experience, it's all a bit abstract, and I like to use this slide as an illustration. But as I said, scientists have developed ways of measuring these things. I'm going to show you the very measure we use. It's called a mystical experience questionnaire. You don't have to read the whole thing, but it's basically composed of 4 factors. The first factor is the mystical experience. writ large, and that is experiences of both internal and external unity. So you feel at one with yourself, with the universe. It has a noetic quality. It feels like you're accessing some deep truth about the nature of the universe, and that it has a sense of the sacred about it as well, like it's somehow touching or apprehending something divine. The other three factors are long-lasting positive mood, so experiences of awe, bliss, ecstasy, love, compassion, empathy, and so on. The transcendence of time and space, you know, a few moments can last like a few million years, or you find yourself on the other side of the planet seeing what your cousins are doing. And the other one is, the final one is ineffability. That means you can't actually put it into words very easily and tell your mates down the pub what actually happened on a Friday night. So that's the mystical experience, and if you kind of, the more like that it is, the more likely you are to have reductions in your clinical outcomes. Which is all well and good for people that have, you know, mental health diagnoses, but what about everybody else? You know, the rest of the population who don't have a psychiatric diagnosis, what we call in clinical research healthy normals, but which actually equates to kind of functioning neurotics, basically. And in fact, a lot of this research, they initially test these things for safety, first of all, on so-called healthy normals, and in recent psychedelic research renaissance, there's been something like 10,000 people who have gone through those trials, across 77 different clinical trials, and they found, when they applied all these different measures, that the use of psychedelics in these studies could enhance mood, well-being, pro-social behaviours, that means doing things for other people, not just yourself, enhanced empathy, enhanced cognitive flexibility, creativity, which I'll come back to, increase of personality factors like openness to experience, which means like engaging in other cultural practices, listening to different music, looking at different art, tasting different foods, enhanced value orientations, nature-relatedness, which I'll come back to as well, enhanced spirituality, self-transcendence, and mindful-related capabilities. So, you know, potentially, even people without a psychiatric diagnosis could benefit from a psychedelic experience, so long as they are those people who only ever have bad trips. So I'm going to drill down to a couple of these, and I'm going to wrap it up and open up for Q&A. And the first area I want to look into is an area of research I've been looking into recently myself, and that is the use of psychedelics for non-clinical purposes to enhance creativity, right? And everybody knows what happened in the 60s, yeah, we were all there, more or less. And we know that, you know, the psychedelic 60s had a massive cultural footprint in terms of its impact and influence on music and art and language and fashion and so on, but people are perhaps less aware of the massive impact that psychedelics had on technology and science and innovation. For instance, Silicon Valley, the home of the home computing industry, the whole home computing industry was kind of born in the 1960s in the vicinity of, you know, the epicenter of the psychedelic hippie 60s, Haight-Ashbury in the Bay Area. And pretty much every kind of home computing industry startup company were experimenting with psychedelics. And people like Steve Jobs, you may have heard of, a few products apparently. He said taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things he did in his life, right? And he doesn't think he would kind of make Apple the way it was if he hadn't taken LSD. Even Bill Gates took LSD, right? Although Steve Jobs said he didn't take enough, or his products would be more interesting. You know, even the guy who invented the mouse, do you remember? You don't see him anymore. He said he attributed that to his experimentation with LSD. So the whole home computing industry was buoyed up. They were all basically tripping. There's branches of theoretical physics which benefited from the use of psychedelics in that time as well. The government changed their funding for physics, and loads of physicists were suddenly out of work. They couldn't do lab research, and so they turned to theoretical physics and experimented with psychedelics. And they came up with tests of non-locality, quantum cryptography, and quantum computing, basically, which is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there was some research in that time, just only one study in the 1960s, where they gave people LSD or mescaline, and they took top-level like architects, designers, engineers, scientists, and they had to work on their research or work-related problems, okay? Come up with some solutions. And they had to come up with either a new product, a new patent, or a publication. And these are some of the things that they came up with. Most of them had some kind of breakthrough, such as a mathematical theorem and NOR gate circuits, a new conceptual model of a photon, a linear electron accelerator beam steering, I don't know what that is, but it sounds good, and so on and so forth. So, you know, by that measure, it was successful. However, that research was one of the last studies to be conducted at the end of the 60s before Prohibition, and this research kind of basically languished for over 50 years. There was one guy in the late 1980s called Jeremy Narby, who was an anthropologist. He wrote this famous book called The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge. And he spent a lot of time in the Amazon, working with this tribe called the Ashaninka, and they knew a lot about, you know, the various medicinal uses of all plants in the jungle. And he asked them, well, how do you know so much about the medicinal uses of all these multitudinous plants? He says, well, the plants told us. And he's like, what do you mean? And he says, well, you know, you have to drink ayahuasca if you understand. He's like, oh, what? Has anyone heard of ayahuasca? Is anyone handling right now? Good. Yeah. So he basically drank ayahuasca with him, totally changed his world. He thought they were like really nice people, but a bit crazy before that, and then he realised that he was the crazy one after that point. Totally changed his worldview. But he also observed that often in their ayahuasca visions, a lot of the ayahuasca artists would depict these double helix snakes, these serpents, who kind of pop up in their kind of very colourful visions a lot. And he figured basically they've symbolised a DNA. They're basically observing DNA, which doesn't sound very practical or possible because DNA is very small. Right? And so his kind of academic colleagues somewhat laughed at him. Until about the same time, weirdly enough, a man called Carrie Mullis, which nobody had ever heard of until a couple of years ago, won the Nobel Prize in biochemistry for his development of what's called PCR. Have you heard of PCR? You have now, after the pandemic. You probably have PCR tests, right? Polymerase chain reaction means you take a single strand of DNA and replicate it. Therefore, it's kind of the basis of all genetic research, genome mapping, sequencing, testing, forensics, whatever, you name it. It's all based and uses PCR. Massive innovation. And it turns out, after he got his Nobel Prize, he basically said, well, yeah, I've taken loads of LSD. Right, I could fly alongside the strands with the DNA molecule at a molecular level and see what was going on. They didn't take his prize on it. Turns out as well, a bit of a apocryphal story perhaps, that Francis Crick of Crick and Watson fame, the co-winners of the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the DNA double helix structure, having nicked their data from Rosalind Franklin, who didn't get a Nobel Prize, I have to say, but does get an honorable mention, turns out Crick supposedly was on LSD at the time he came up with the structure. We don't know if that's true because the story came out after his death, but it's a good yarn and possibly true. Anyway, Narby, being a good kind of scientifically, medically trained anthropologist, he wanted to test this idea. He found 3 molecular biologists who all had a kind of block in their research. He took them all out to the Amazon. They all took ayahuasca. They've never heard of it. They've never been to the Amazon. And all 3 of them had a breakthrough in their research. 2 of them totally changed their worldview as well. And one of them said she was able to fly alongside the strands of the DNA molecule at molecular level and see what was going on, much like Carrie Mullis. So when indigenous shamans or ayahuasca heroes take these substances and they say they can see inside bodies, they can see inside organs, they can see cells, they can see DNA, are they speaking metaphorically or can they actually do that? And it's very difficult to imagine. But that's a whole other discussion, probably a whole other talk. But the idea is then that potentially, it doesn't matter if it's real or not, but that through the use of psychedelics, people with kind of a lot of training in a particular specific domain can have great breakthroughs and insights. So I was lucky enough to do a replication of this experiment. First one from the one in the 60s in a hospital in North London a few years ago, and we took 40, what's more than that, 40 top-level scientists from Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, all like biologists, engineers, mathematicians, physicists, you name it, and most of them had never taken a psychedelic before in their life. They came to a lab and they took LSD with a view to working on their toughest kind of theoretical problems in their field that they were working on, that had no current solutions. Unfortunately, we're still writing the papers on that, so it's still in Margaret. But I can say it was a lot of fun doing that as a research project, and they all felt like that they had some kind of breakthrough. I can show you this actually, because one of them de-environment themselves. I can't tell you what it is, I'll have to kill you. So basically, no, actually, he was working on in creating intelligent fabric. He was a material scientist, and he'd been working on this chainmail idea. He's trying to program fabrics into take any 3D shape. Right? And he'd been working on this chainmail idea, which didn't really work. And then within about half an hour of coming in on his LSD, he went, oh, eureka, kind of didn't quite make it out the door naked. That would have been trouble. But did have this insight that he had to have these kind of interlocking pyramids come together with rings which you could program to contract or expand, and therefore take any kind of 3D laminar shape, which he then sketched, CAD designed, 3D printed, and patented, and it's now being developed by NASA and MIT. So, that was quite useful for him, I would say, although he didn't actually make any money out of it, but never mind. So, the potential of these things for enhancing creative insight and creative problem solving shouldn't necessarily be overlooked as well. But all that research was done in the 60s too. I mean, what's new in psychedelic research? A lot of the new stuff is coming through fields of biology and physiology and medicine outside of psychiatry. And we're discovering new potential uses for psychedelics in all kinds of ways, such as the fact that psychedelics might be really useful anti-inflammatory agents. So some classic psychedelics, which are not very popular, largely because they last about 36 hours or something like that. It's a bit hard to do of an evening. The DOI, for instance, is known to have an anti-inflammatory index about 1,000 times greater than anything else we currently know of, which has potential uses in treating all kinds of any kind of condition, because a lot of kind of current medical diseases have inflammation somehow implicated in them, everything from Alzheimer's to arthritis and depression. So the potential uses as anti-inflammatory agents. The potential uses in autoimmune system or immune system modulation. It turns out psychedelics are massive positive immune system modulators. So again, various other studies underway with all kinds of other uses. A lot of it's to do with psychiatry. However, we're going to talk about fibromyalgia, potentially in treating pain, headaches, and of course the fairly recent discovery that psychedelics are. I mean, people are trying to rename them as plastogens, in that they assist in neuroplasticity or neurogenesis, which is the creation and formation of new brain cells, new dendrites, new brain connections, which is kind of thought to be a positive thing, particularly as it regards to kind of cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases, so potentially treatments for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or whatever. Just going to finish off the term I kind of came up with. This is, I think, psychedelics can enhance eco-psychogenesis, which is the potential of making people feel more connected to nature and natural environment. Nobody had done any research on this. It's one of those things that hippies banged on about. There wasn't any data for, and so I did a survey, the first one a few years ago, and asked people, a whole bunch of people taking psychedelics, how it would change their relationship to nature, and whether or not they interact more or less with nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. The vast majority interacted with nature more. And this is something you don't ever get in psychological research or human research of any kind, is when you ask a big sample of people a particular question, you'd never expect to get 100% of them responding in the affirmative, which they did in our survey. That is, everybody taking the psychedelics in our sample said, sounds like an advert for cat food, doesn't it? No, that wasn't, they didn't say that. They said that they had increased their connection to nature as a result. So they felt more connected to nature, every one of them, as a result of taking psychedelics, and most of them also felt more concerned about nature. We also wanted to know, fundamentally, which one psychedelic substance is most likely to help save the planet. Anybody got any guesses? Magic mushrooms, you're absolutely right, yeah, psilocybin was the number one substance that people felt made them feel more connected and concerned for nature. Some of them actually seem to go the other direction, like ketamine, which isn't too surprising. It's dissociative anesthetic and makes you feel pretty much disconnected and less concerned about everything. You know, that whole experience. We also wanted to know about, it's all good that these things change people's attitudes towards nature, but does it change people's behaviours as they report them? And we found that those people taking psychedelics said it, the majority of them said they changed their diet as a result of taking psychedelics, such as, I don't know what they became, but you know, maybe vegetarian or vegan or freegan or, I don't know, vegan. Vegan, is that what vegan? It's vegan. And also, this is the take-home kind of headline news I wanted to get in front of the Daily Mail. I didn't quite manage it, but in the back pages of the Observer, was that it's just over half of people are taking psychedelics said they make them increase the amount of gardening they do. Stop press. Dangerous psychedelics turn people into rampant gardeners. And but more seriously, like 16% of people down the bottom of the scale change their career to something more ecologically orientated as a result of taking psychedelics. To give you an example, 2 of the people in our sample quit their jobs and took up PhDs in botany, the study of plants, which is a dying subject. So me and a bunch of colleagues put forward a paper and we suggested it's all well and good people taking psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in a clinic or a hospital or a lab, but and even when they do, we find that it increases their connection to nature, even in a sterile environment. But imagine if you give people psilocybin psychotherapy in a forest or next to a lake or by a waterfall. They're more likely to boost their connection to nature, which is a really positive thing, because the more you are connected to nature, the more time you spend in nature, the more time you spend in nature, the better it is for your mental health. Every hour you spend in nature, there's a significant difference in your anxiety, and so it's a kind of positive feedback loop. It's like you feel more connected to nature, you spend more time in nature, you start feeling even better, and so on and so forth. So we were suggesting, you know, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in your local woodlands. Hasn't taken off yet, because like, it's still illegal, obviously. But anyway, so it's kind of an intersection between ecology and psychology. Not only do kind of psychedelics change attitudes and behaviours and enhance well-being, but that can also have the effect then of people taking more concern and care for the environment, enhancing the environment. There's potential use of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in helping people deal with ecological crisis, existential crisis around that. And then we can have probably better creative problem solving around ecological issues as well. If you think about a creativity study of giving people involved in dealing with kind of trying to crack ecological problems, which is mostly humans as a problem, you know, they can come up with better solutions. And not only just better solutions, but they may come up with more ecologically orientated solutions, i.e. ones from a non-human perspective. I'll give you an example of this and I'll finish. And that is in in our actual study, one of the participants was Merlin Sheldrake. He's really recently wrote this amazing book, which I recommend everybody to read. It's called Entangled Life. It's everything you ever wanted to know about fungus. And it's based on his PhD research. And he came to us, he spent 3 years at Cambridge doing his PhD on the relationship between this fungus and a plant. And he still doesn't have a clue about the nature of the relationship, whether it was parasitic or not. I thought it was parasitic. Basically, this plant grows out of fungus, but the plant gets all its energy directly from the fungus, so it doesn't photosynthesize. It has no chlorophyll. It's kind of totally translucent, and it was always thought to be parasitic. And he came into our lab after 3 years of studying it, and took the LSD, and we interviewed all our scientists afterwards. You know, asked them, you know, did you have any breakthroughs? How was your experience? We said, how was your experience? And he said, he turned into the fungus. That's good. Is that useful? What was that like? And he said, slimy. Okay. I didn't go actually, it was how poor, it was probably a waste of LSD. But it turns out that he published this amazing book, and he said actually gave a whole new insight, not just on his own PhD problem, but how we can do better science and better biology by kind of shifting our perspective to you know, other than human species, particularly when doing biology. So you imagine giving psychedelics to kind of biologists, ecologists, I don't know, solar tech people, architects, agriculturalists, farmers, you know, they could probably potentially do more better ecological design. I'm not going to talk about shamanic doctor plants or weather control, But that, we do owe a debt of gratitude to the indigenous people who've been using these substances for thousands of years, because they don't see themselves as being outside of nature, they see themselves as a part of nature, not apart from it, and they engage with nature in a way of reciprocity. It's like you never take more than you need, you only ever take, you never take without giving, first of all, and it's about communication and balance and harmony with nature. So I'm going to finish off by summarising what is it we've learned in the psychedelic research renaissance. To sum it all up, is that psychedelics enhance connectivity on every level, pretty much, as a general rule, a tendency anyway. And that is like from the very, very small to very, very big, from the biological, the psychological, the sociological, the ecological, cosmological, even the theological level, right? We see enhanced connectivity with psychedelics on a biological level. We see that, as you were on my brain, enhanced connectivity between different parts of the brain, which probably helps give rise to better creative problem-solving insights by having kind of what we call divergent thinking. On a psychological level, people feel more connected to themselves, to their own unconscious material, to their own drives, desires, fears, motives, traumas, and that they feel more connected to themselves and better able to then deal with their mental health issues, depression and so on. On a sociological level, people feel more connected to each other. People engage in more pro-social behaviours, they do things for people, they have more empathy, they have more compassion, they're more kind of open to experience, more willing to engage in other cultural practices, they're more community-minded, and they have reductions in authoritarianism. And that spills over then on the ecological level, where people change their attitudes, they feel more connected to nature, they turn into rampant gardeners, and that spills over onto the cosmological level, people feel more connected to the cosmos itself, which also then spills over potentially into a deeper connection with something divine. That's it in a nutshell. You've been a great audience. This is my book, I was just going to tell you about, and that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.